Just your thoughts and reaction to what we're seeing among the Chinese EV makers today. These stocks are popping. Why?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with a lot of these Chinese EV makers, their profit margins will fall below the threshold of the tariffs. So they will still be able to export to Europe and be able to make some sort of profit. And particularly compared with the profits that these companies are making in China, where there's cutthroat competition, being able to export and actually, make some money on the cars that they're selling is really important. So those brands that are able to kind of get past that threshold, I think there's a lot of optimism behind those. Whereas some of the companies like SAIC and others that are hitting that full 38% plus the 10% that the EU has for all imported EVs, those companies will struggle to remain profitable. And so I think there's a more gloomy outlook on them.
Jacob, as we continue to watch the EV companies in China further their global expansion, do you have any idea or an indication, are you able to quantify the impact on the potential decline in imports from these Chinese car companies? How many cars could be affected by these tariffs?
Yeah, the calculations are still kind of in the running because we have the provisional tariffs coming out today, but the definitive tariffs won't be coming out until near the end of the year. And I think a lot of Chinese companies are also trying to calculate how much of a hit to their profit margins can they take, and also how much can they try to, as you just mentioned, invest in Southeast Asia or invest in nearby markets or even in the EU itself to find ways around this export question from China to kind of get around the tariffs. But for now, I think the real hit will be on mostly the state-owned enterprise car makers, because those are the ones that I understand were the least cooperative with the investigations. And so those are the companies I expect to be hit the hardest. Whereas you can see on this list that you have of Chinese EV makers on the screen right now, these are overwhelmingly the private companies that have been more cooperative with the investigators in the EU. And frankly, that benefit a little bit less from the state aid and the subsidies and the cheap loans and such of the Chinese economic model that state-owned companies benefit from even more than private companies.
As we talk about and watch out for retaliation, there could be extra tariffs on cognac, on pork, on luxury cars. What do you think the Chinese retaliation will look like?
Yeah, first, I think that the Chinese side has a good reason to be cautious in a way that they normally don't. In the past, we see China respond to these sorts of things with economic coercion pretty aggressively and quickly. I think the response from Beijing so far has been relatively muted because they recognize that with the U.S. having much more significant and blatant tariffs, and with other major markets increasingly putting up their own barriers, that Europe is sort of the last really big, rich market that is, broadly speaking, open to Chinese imports. So I think they want to preserve the relationship there. But what they have signaled is on, as you said, pork, also dairy products, and automotive exports. And I think the pork and the dairy and the cognac and luxury kind of food and agriculture, food and beverage items are pretty credible threats. These are either things that are kind of luxuries that Beijing thinks that the people in China can do without, or in the case of pork, this is a commodity where pork is kind of has an oversupply issue in China, so they want to shore up pork prices for their producers at home. And then lastly, for the automotive exports from the EU to China, those have actually been steadily declining in the last few years anyway. So the marginal increase in tariff rates that China has threatened, specifically on 2.5 liter or higher engines, or cars with those engines, a 10 percentage point hike in tariff rates is not going to deter a Chinese consumer who can otherwise afford a €100,000 car. That's not going to be a price-sensitive segment that they're looking at.